So the point of this lecture is going to look at sustainable growth and look at food systems in relation to sustainable growth. So to begin with, sustainable growth is quite a complex term. And those of you that have paid attention to my first couple lectures will understand that when we're talking about sustainability, there's multiple approaches and multiple ways to think about sustainability. You know, talking about sustainable development usually looks at the triple bottom line, so looking at people, planet, and profitability. And actually what I was describing before is usually profitability takes a larger precedent over people and the planet. And the better approach is to actually look at nested models. And the nested model, what we'll understand within that is we need to look at different hierarchies. So the hierarchy of the planet itself has the importance over the social aspects, which has importance over the profitability or the economy. And why am I saying that is because without the larger hierarchical systems in place, it will do away with the other ones. So if you do not have a planet, you cannot have a social system. If you don't have a social system, you cannot have an economy. I also referenced in the last lecture Vandana Shiva that looks at the idea is that we have to flip around our understanding of the economy presently, because the way that we understand it presently is we prioritize financial markets, and then after that our daily sustenance, and then after that we prioritize the planet, usually kind of in the later approach or the last approach, which is not the way that we should design sustainable futures. Because if we do away with our ability to sustain ourselves or the planet, then we cannot have an economy. We have to realize this. So what is this whole idea of growth, and how could growth be sustainable? Well, there's a lot of arguments to put out that growth is not very sustainable, and we shouldn't necessarily look at growth models for our economy. Okay? We measure growth usually through GDP or NDP, so GDP, gross domestic product. We're looking at all of the productive forces within an economy, so how much production took place, and usually is measured by the amount of growth. So our economy usually grows by, and Canada's growing by about 2%, although the predictions since COVID has been around is that the economy is probably going to shrink quite a bit because the productive elements of our society have been constrained and have diminished because of the current pandemic, but also because of some unsustainable issues with our current economy. So we could look at NDP, national domestic product. We could take GDP and minus all the liabilities in our economy as well, and we could look at that through a nation. But these are measurements that are econometrics that actually measure everything that comes under capitalism. So it measures the trade that happens through markets, and anything that basically passes through a market is recorded in GDP or NDP. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't take into consideration all of these other elements that Gibson Graham talk about. So the diverse economy. It does not talk about things that are family labor. It doesn't talk about any kind of barter networks, or it doesn't talk about large parts of the economy that go really unnoticed. So if we really want to describe an economy, we have to look at all of these other things that actually maintain the functioning of our economy and our society. The other thing to address also is it even possible to perpetuate sustained economic growth, especially considering we have finite resources on this planet, and most of the productive elements come from these finite resources. So there's an argument that yes, we could grow knowledge economies and we could grow things that are intangible, sure, but a lot of the things that we actually perpetuate in our economy are things that are not, and are actually based on these finite resources. Especially, there's a large kind of impetus right now to redevelop or to continue to develop an oil economy and a coal economy and all of these other things. Now, why are nations doing that is because for some of them, or some even companies within that, it's profitable for these companies. I would say right now oil is not necessarily the most profitable, but because the Canadian government is putting so much money into this presently, that actually we're sustaining kind of artificially the profits of oil companies who, there's many different examples, but actually will abandon their facilities if they run out of money and actually let the public clean this up. As well as they don't necessarily try to curb their carbon emissions and don't necessarily protect lands and waters when pipelines are going through protected rivers or other things that actually communities and indigenous communities especially are depending on for their survival. So, we could even put this idea of growth into question and say, well, why is it that we keep on trying to grow our economy? And why is it that we're actually trying to lead as fast as possible to our own destruction by consuming all of our finite resources? Do we want to sustain the economy for future generations to be able to participate on this planet? And if so, then we really need to rethink what we're up to right now. So if we're talking about sustainable growth, a lot of the conversation actually happens through the economic conversation. So we could look at the microeconomic conversation, and what they're looking at is the perpetuation of a company and its own viability. So they'll actually define sustainable growth as, is the company able to grow at a certain rate? Because usually they'll have to invest into forms of capital, expanding their productive capacities. And sometimes we'll have to take out debt or other things, and that will not be sustainable for this company in the longer term. If a company grows to an extent of like doubling or tripling their endeavors, this is actually unsustainable for a lot of companies. And some companies will go bankrupt because they've taken on too much debt, or they put too much into their growth and can't sustain this functionally. So, there's a microeconomic element to this, but it has nothing to do with our ability to self-perpetuate and for the biosphere to keep on perpetuating either. So basically, these arguments leave out the environmental and the social aspects of the perpetuation of this company here. What we need to do is we need to have other approaches. And if you look at actually sustainable investing, what they call ESG models. So sustainable investments will look at environmental, social, and governance and basically get scored on them. The idea here is that if you have an ESG model, you're prioritizing companies that have better environmental, social, and governance capabilities or practices. Now, this is flawed also because when companies are rated on these things, what we're looking at is investing from certain industries where companies are compared against each other. And we could say that certain industries probably shouldn't exist because of the environmental destruction that they're causing to the world or social destruction. But ESG models don't take those things into consideration. There's also a discussion about sustainable intensification. So this whole idea, especially through the Green Revolution, is that if we intensify our growing capacities, this is going to be better for the environment because we can now have higher yields on smaller surfaces of the environment. We could create kind of conditions for sustainable intensification, usually by introducing kind of GMO crops that are high yielding or considered high yielding, or higher technologies, more efficient technologies, or other things like that. But with sustainable intensification, sometimes we're not addressing root causes of problems because by introducing GMO technologies, we're limiting biodiversity. And by limiting biodiversity, we're actually causing a whole bunch of problems, with our kind of future perpetuation of these systems. So sustainable intensification has been kind of this thing about produce more with as little as possible, which sounds really great, but in the bigger picture, has its consequences on its own also. And like I've been telling you all, the big problem with our economy right now in food is not about production, because we could feed the world over about 1.5 times. It's actually about distribution and basically the capacity to share food amongst people in the world and to allow people in different economic brackets or people in conditions where they're not necessarily part of this bigger capitalist system, or sometimes are the people that are kind of at the bottom end that are producing for the rest of the world that are not able to purchase these products. Basically, they're not able to meet their food rations. So sustainable intensification, although it sounds good in practice, is not necessarily addressing the root causes of these problems. So how do we get to these root causes? Well, what we need to do is we need to start to question what growth is, and we need to question value. So the real question is what should we grow? Not how much of it should we grow necessarily, but what is it, first of all, that we actually want to grow in our society? What is it that brings value to us and the planet? Okay? And if we could address it that way, well, if we create values that are actually beneficial rather than values that are not, then we could start to reorient our societies and our economies to actually be better for the people on the planet. There are many ways to think about this, okay? There's actually, this has been written about quite a bit by authors like John Kenneth Galbraith, for example. This is just one author. who wrote a book called The Affluent Society, and actually put into question this idea of growth. And this is back, I think, in the 1950s, if I'm not mistaken. But the idea here is that was put forward is that we don't need to just continuously grow the productive capacities, but we need to grow the right ones. And for John Kenneth Galbraith, the major or the more important thing is to actually grow things in the public system that actually are beneficial for people and the planet. So what are these things? Let's just say, if we are to grow the idea of having more healthy societies, we probably want to have better hospital services and things to do with health. And if we actually put money towards these endeavors, we're actually creating jobs in these endeavors also. So basically, it's about providing value to society by bringing things into the world that are helpful rather than harmful. And I know it's very hard to think of these things as absolutes because there's nothing that's completely helpful and completely harmful, but we could think of ways of actually reprioritizing value and creating the values that are better for the world. So if we're looking at value, this is quite complex also. There's many books that have been written on value. So you can go back to kind of the traditional economists like Ricardo, who's written about value. Karl Marx has written about value, a whole bunch of different approaches to look at value. One way to quantify value is actually by looking at valorization or the formation of capital. So capital, you could look at stocks, you could look at things that people accumulate over time. You could also look at capital flow and how things are being produced and come into fruition. So one really interesting approach is actually from a book called Regenerative Enterprise. And basically the idea here is that they're looking at different forms of capital that exist in the world and things that actually should come into existence, or things that create value, basically. And what we could look at is what kind of values are being created under these conditions. So what they look at is 8 different forms of value. So social capital, material capital, financial capital, living capital, intellectual capital, experiential capital, spiritual capital, and cultural capital. So just really quickly, what do these things mean? So social capital could mean kind of your extent in your community. How is it that you can form relationships with people? How do you build communities? How do you build social endeavors? How do you build social networks? How do you connect with people in the bigger picture? Some people will say I have a lot of social capital, kind of meaning they have a lot of influence over social networks. We don't have to look at it in the way of like profiting or about influence. We could look at it in a way of community building also. Places with big social capital are probably more resilient in their economies because they probably have better sharing networks and other things as well. There's definitely material capital. This is one way that we can understand this also, is you can accumulate things. Anything that comes into production that is tangible, like any kind of materials that are performed or that have labor inputs to them, usually form something that is tangible, like clothing, like even food is material. So all of these things are forms of capital also. And actually, usually the commodity is the form of capital, or one form of capital that we really think about as a formation of capital. So things that are material. But the other one is financial also. So we look at financial capital, especially in the stock markets. We can measure stocks. We can measure trading. We could look at business loans. We could look at how much money people have. So these forms of capital between material and financial capital are usually the way we define capital. So we look at capital flows, money flows. We're also looking at the things that are produced. So the commodities within it are material and financial. So these are the two usually more important things in an economy, but there's other things also. So I talked about social capital, but there's living capital also. So there's things that actually reproduce themselves. For us to survive as humans, we need to reproduce ourselves. We need to eat. We need to do things that actually, are performative in our living conditions. The planet does the same thing. So if you were to actually leave water on its own, it usually actually filters itself. It runs through streams, it runs through mountains, it runs through, different environments. Usually in the processing of that, or, in its own running downstream, will actually cleanse itself as well. It gets reabsorbed back into the atmosphere, rain occurs, it runs down mountains again. So the world actually is a living thing that continuously replenishes itself and cleans itself also. Food on itself is living capital, and that we don't need to touch food, especially if it's a perennial plant. It'll produce on its own. You take an apple tree and you put it in conditions for it to thrive and you leave it, it'll produce apples. It doesn't need you and your intervention. Intellectual capital. So we could think of formation of knowledge, doing research, and all of these things also, which are very important to our understanding of the world. And certain forms of intellectual capital are seen, as not necessarily being as important in the capitalist world. So we actually like intellectual capital that produces profits or are able to be bought and sold. So pharmaceutical companies like to patent things of intellectual capital to make finance capital off of it. But these things also don't have to exist through capitalism, especially if you're in, First Nations communities or part of Indigenous communities in Canada and United States, or even throughout the world. There's different forms of intellectual capital that basically are more performative and basically are, resonate more with the understanding of symbiotic relationship with the world. These things are usually not commodified though. So there's experiential capital. By doing things, you learn things. Kind of like if you learn how to ride a bike, you'll never forget. Well, if you experience certain things, these are ways for your procedural knowledge then start to gain, more what they call experiential capital. Is that you know how to do things. You might not be able to explain it to anybody of how to do it, but you'll understand what your experience is by just doing it. I would say gardening is a very, very good realm of experiential capital, is that you will be doing things performatively, maybe not think about it because it's kind of second nature at this point. I know playing an instrument, riding a bike, all of these things that are procedural usually come to you. You know how to do it, but it might be hard to explain it to others. The spiritual capital doesn't necessarily have to do with religion, but it could be your connection to the world or your surroundings. These are other forms of capital also. So, we're hopefully understanding that we are part of nature and part of other social contexts that are bigger than just us individually. So that is also part of our capital understanding. And cultural capital. So any kind of like media form or any kind of performative experience out in the world is part of a cultural capital. What people do together and come together over, and these things go to define what culture is. So different, drawings and music and anything that people experience is part of cultural capital. So there are ways that this could be, that these forms of capital could flourish and produce value that are outside of markets, or sometimes inside of markets. But the idea here is that material capital and financial capital seem to be the forefront of our understanding of our economic system when there are so many other forms of value that need to be produced also. And these forms of value, a lot of them have positive effects on the world and should be part of our consideration of value production. Okay, so to get into the chapters, you'll notice actually there's a very strong, impetus towards propagating, or a strong propagation towards a Mediterranean diet. Okay, so Mediterranean diets, basically looking at kind of the Mediterranean region. There's a bunch of different foods that came out of that. At the beginning, it was more based in kind of like oils and wines and those kind of foods, but have gone on to incorporate a whole bunch of different things into the understanding and the diet. But basically here, as kind of quoted from the book, it's also more of a lifestyle as well. So basically talking about different kind of cultures from the Mediterranean basin that now participate in fishing and other kind of food preparation. Today's Mediterranean diet is very heavily based on having diversity, but basing it on plant-based foods, okay? And there's quite a nuanced understanding of Mediterranean diets. A lot of countries have kind of taken this approach and contextualize it to make it make sense for them. Canada's food guide actually presently is towards this idea of a Mediterranean diet. Although it deviates slightly from it, is in line with a lot of the understandings of the Mediterranean diet. So you can actually take a look at Canada's food guide, which was revamped very recently, and some of the categories were pulled out of the food guide and reflects kind of an impetus towards going towards plant-based foods rather than going towards meat and other things like that. But there is a critique that was not addressed in the textbook about this. The one critique is it infringes on Indigenous sovereignty. So it's part of a colonial imposition that was brought over. And basically this diet has been imposed onto individuals who don't necessarily, who don't have the same context, either geographically or even, digestionally can't digest the same types of food because of their living conditions and biology. So it is an infringement on indigenous food sovereignty, and it shouldn't be taken as an approach. The only diet that should be had is the Mediterranean diet. Okay? Also, access is another critique, is that people don't have access to all of these foods. So if you're living in, let's just say, the Arctic regions, or up north in Quebec or in Canada, it's very hard to actually get all plant-based foods. A lot of time they rely on what is called comfort foods, or part of a Inuit diet is polar bears and seals and other things that are not necessarily part of this Mediterranean diet. So the idea basically is that without access to the Mediterranean diet, it's very hard to propagate this as the only way of eating. So there's a political and social context to this. There's also food restrictions, so not everybody could eat the foods that are being propagated through the Mediterranean diet. Nonetheless, it's seen as quite a healthy way to eat. We're going to deconstruct why. So looking at this double food pyramid, this is one of the major things being purported in these two chapters. And in order to curb our carbon and water footprint, or basically the environmental footprint, and to get high nutrient dense foods, we could actually notice that some of these foods are, first of all, the ones that are the most problematic are the less nutrient dense compared to the calories that people intake, and actually are the most polluting. So if we're looking at meats especially, meats are less nutrient dense for the amount of calories that they have, okay? And the ones that are high nutrient dense for very little calories are fruits and vegetables. You can take a look at the suggested consumption, and as you see in the pyramid, the ones that are high here on the bottom are high nutrient dense, basically in comparison to their caloric intake level, or the calorie level. And at the top, these are less nutrient dense compared to their caloric intake, or basically compared to the calories that are being consumed. We look at the environmental pyramid. So we have the ones at the high end of this are the ones that actually have a lot of inputs going into them. So meat and beef and all of these things at the top of it actually usually go through more than one process. So beef, a lot of people think, well, we just raise a cow, you have to feed the cow, you have to give it water and all of these things. And don't take into consideration the things that happen before that. So to feed a cow, usually we're feeding it grains and other products. So feed pigs soy products and other things basically that are usually grown in conditions like the Amazon or other places where we're using arable land to grow things that we're going to feed the animals with. So not only do we have to give the animals water and food, but we have to produce the food in order to feed the animals the food that could be consumed by us. So in order to grow soy, in order to grow grains, we actually need water for that, and we need land for it. And we could see that we're also devastating certain soils if we keep on growing these things over it and not necessarily taking care of the soil, but then using these products and feeding animals. So we basically have to grow two foods in order to get one form of food here. So meat is quite heavily taxing because we have to grow food in order to feed the animals, and at the same time, we're using water in the food to feed the animals, and then we're using it for the animals also. So these things actually have a very high impact on the environment in a negative fashion. We actually look at the aspects of climate change. The International Panel on Climate Change has talked about meat consumption and how destructive it is for our environment. So if we look at here, these are the environmental pyramid. The things at the top are quite highly taxing on our environment, going down to the ones that are least taxing, okay? And we can notice a pattern here. The ones that are very low caloric intake, that have very high nutrient densities, are also the ones that are least impactful on our environment. And the ones at the top that have very high caloric intake for less calories are also the more taxing on our environment. So here they're quantifying these different things. And actually, if you go through the chapter, you could read more all about this. But they're talking about grams of carbon dioxide per kilogram or liter of food. You can see here, beef is at the top of this. And then basically cheese, butter, pork, fish, poultry, rice, eggs, cereal, breakfast, oils, sweets, basically going all the way down to fruits and vegetables are somewhat of the least taxing on the environment, although you can see that there is variability within this as well. Okay, so here seasonal vegetables, depending on what we're getting, could be more or less have more or less carbon dioxide. Anyhow, so this is looking at carbon dioxide per liter of food or per kilogram. We could also look at this in water comparisons, and we'll notice very similar things. Is that usually the ones that we identified as the most problematic are still the ones at the top here. You know, we need to feed animals water, but at the same time we need to grow the food to feed the animals feed, and that requires water also. Usually it's kind of these things, you know, the cereals and other stuff that's getting produced that's going to feed the animals. So if we're looking at this double pyramid, then we could actually identify things that are better for us and better for the environment. If we were to eat lots of fruits and vegetables and grains and cereals and things like that, we're going to have a lot more nutrients and a lot less calories. So basically we're taking in more nutrients compared to the calories and actually doing less environmental damage as well. All right, so kind of resume some of the things that they've described in the chapter. So they define sustainable agriculture systems are able to effectively and comprehensively meet the food, fuel, and fiber needs of today without compromising the ability of future generations to meet the needs of tomorrow. What are we saying here? It's not just about sustainability in kind of this vacuum context, but it means that, you know, who are we leaving the planet to in the future, and what kind of context do they have to continue to perpetuate the biosphere and to perpetuate their own needs within it? And actually a lot of the doom and gloom scenarios are looking at the future in a very negative context because of the practices that we're doing now. So soil arability is not going to last forever. If we continue to use the agricultural methods of monoculture farming and limit biodiversity and basically use these external inputs like you know, fertilizers and pesticides and all of this stuff, especially if we're doing monoculture farming and not having perennials within it, you know, we're seeing soil erosions and soil that's not able to contain nutrients anymore, and basically soil that would be considered dead soil. So these things are going to be a problem, and there are different predictions and different models, but we're looking at like 50 years in the future that we're going to have very little arable soil. You know, the same is with our drinking water. So we look at water and the water conservation, and you know, there is a time frame where there's predictions to say that we probably will not have safe drinking water anymore, or you know, water that's potable and able to use for agricultural purposes. We need to rethink how we understand water and how we prioritize water, and basically how we use it in agriculture. Okay, we need water for plants to grow, yes, but there are ways to do this more effectively than we're doing right now. So we're looking at food security. This is one element of sustainability. We need to sustain ourselves. So we need to have, and basically they're looking at 4 pillars described by the UN. Availability, means to access the food, safe consumption of the food so that it's sanitary, and consistent access. So not just one time, but continued access to these kind of foods. There's also barriers when it comes to price and affordability. So some people in the world don't have the same conditions of actually being able to buy food at those prices. We actually look at you know, wars that have existed. The Arab Springs, one of the explanations as to why Egypt and Tunisia entered into the Arab Springs, or basically, you know, started to have their civil unrest, is actually food fluctuations. Food prices started to spike, and some people will say that this was a catalyst for, you know, individuals to then start to lash back against the governments. There's multiple explanations. I don't want to pigeonhole this one, but that is one of the explanations for sure. So price fluctuations also. We have the food on stock markets. It's a tradable commodity that people could buy and sell and actually invest into. These price fluctuations have a drastic effect on people, and they're able to afford food. So why do we have the food on these kind of markets where fluctuations happen quite readily? And why is food in this global trade? We're saying food is something that's a necessity for people and people have the right to food. Well, we should have more stability in the economic possibilities of our food and not have it kind of, you know, only go towards the market initiatives or market fluctuations. The other aspect I talked about is soil degradation. So soil right now is something that maybe we don't think about because we see earth outside and we think, oh, it's just soil. But we need certain conditions of soil. We also need things in the soil like microbes. We need like roots and other structures. We need compost and things that are going to break down. We also need aspects of plants and trees to hold Earth together, because if not, we have erosion problems and other things. So greenhouse gases, not just carbon dioxide, but methane and other forms of gases that are harmful, are in high concentrations in factory farming and other ways of large agricultural methods. Water conservation we talked about as well, but agriculture uses a large portion of our water to the extent of like upwards of 70%, and some countries under that, but depending on what country it is, so you're using quite a bit of water. Food waste. A lot of people are very concerned about food waste from grocery stores, but food waste happens in all different contexts of growing food. So from the beginning, as you probably notice in growing your plant, some of your plants are going to die, and that's technically food waste. You know, you could be growing a broccoli and it doesn't really make it, it dies. Other forms of food waste is actually a lot of what is being harvested at at the farms themselves don't make it to the markets, either because there's been delays in transportation. Some of the food is just wasted altogether because it's not marketable. People don't like to buy things with holes in it, or that have been eaten slightly by bugs. So within farming itself, there's a lot of food waste that takes place. And then transporting stuff to grocery stores, there's food waste because it's hard to conserve food in different environments and actually bring it to the stores. Within the stores, food rots as well. So it's not always good on the shelf. You probably go and pick out some fruits and veggies and realize that, there's a lot of them that don't look very good and you're not going to take that. So food waste happens there. And then the food waste that everybody's concerned about is what happens to the food that's left over at the grocery stores, which is actually not even the large portion of food waste. It is a significant portion, but looking at all these other forms of waste, there's a lot more waste when it comes to food. Anyhow, but it is good to repurpose food. I'm not saying otherwise. So yes, there's food waste that comes from grocery stores. If they don't sell stuff, a lot of times they throw it out or, hopefully repurpose it. But then you as a consumer will buy stuff, and a lot of the food, or maybe some of the food in your fridge, will go to waste also because you don't use it in time. So there's multiple sites of food waste, not just to focus on one of them, but to actually realize in the bigger picture that food waste exists. And in some farms, it's actually part of the method of farming. So some farmers will overplant their crops, and then basically what they call culling, they're going to pull out certain parts of their crops in order to make the other ones strengthen. Why do they do that? Is because if they want to make sure that they have a lively crop and not have seeds not work or function, they actually plant more high density. And if one of the seeds doesn't come up, well, then the other one will take its place. But if they all come up, then they can cull certain plants out and just make sure that the plants that are thriving well will do the best. And they also talk about the future of farming as well. And this is one thing that we're going to be focusing on. I'm not going to get too much into today, but basically we need to revamp our farming methods. And we need to look at producing farms that are more in the way of agroeconomy or permaculture, ones that actually resonate better with people on the planet and are not just producing things that are harmful like monocultures or using GMOs and kind of restricting biodiversity and things that are actually poisonous in our foods for our own health, but also for the health of the soils and the waters and all of these other things. So this is kind of a description of this chapter, but I'm going to give it a little critique as well. So my major critique of this is it focuses too much on individual choices. So basically the forefront of this is you are a consumer, and by you voting with your fork or voting with your dollars is going to be able to change the food economy. And I would say that that is not the case. Markets actually adapt, and people or companies are going to repurpose things. So, if people are not buying certain products because of something, they change markets slightly or they find other markets. And, a good example of this is some of the top oil companies are saying, hey, let's repurpose oil and let's put this into plastic. And actually have been talking about increasing plastic consumption or production, or not consumption, but I guess one will lead to the other. Talking about increasing plastic consumption by almost double. Now, so repurposing oil into other forms is not necessarily beneficial. And if we're talking about eliminating plastic bags, okay, you could not take them from the grocery store as much as you want, but if these companies are doubling the production, they're going to be out there in the world, okay? So a lot of the time, these individual choices don't surmount to the bigger picture because markets are adaptable and you can move to different locations. And you could adapt new markets and basically sell products based on, certain conditions that you're trying to have, basically repurposing some of your main venture. So what we need is we actually need to change institutions, and we need to have collective action at the same time, not just individual choices. And pay attention to this in your food blogs, because if you only go to the individual choices, I'm going to say that you haven't really thought about the larger picture in understanding the aspect of developing sustainable food choices. It's not just about individual choices, but it's actually about understanding collective approaches also. So a food pyramid has to account for the needs of the community, okay? Like I was saying, certain indigenous communities can't necessarily just rely on the stuff that's been talked about in this food pyramid, especially, people living in Inuit villages or other places, don't have the context of producing fruits and vegetables the same way. And actually, if you're looking at food insecurity and food prices, in a lot of these regions, it's actually very expensive to buy that kind of food. So if it's imported, it's usually not coming, through roads and things. It's being brought in by planes. And actually, there's a very heavy cost to some of these things. So this double pyramid needs to account for the needs of the community also. So negative externalities reflect industrial farming methods. So, when they're talking about the heavy footprint on meat production, well, some would argue, well, there are other ways of producing meat that have nothing to do with farming in that method. So some people will purport, I'm a hunter and I'm going to go into the wild and I'm going to shoot game and I'm going to eat that. And actually, if you're looking at kind of these negative approaches that are being discussed, well, we're not using water to produce the animals because they're grazing and doing the things on their own. So these negative externalities discussed in the food pyramids really reflect industrial farming methods. So there's a heavy focus on living capital over financial capital. So I would say that's quite positive, because what they're purporting here is that we need more living capital investments. We need to invest in like the health of the planet and invest in the health of the people over financial capital. But they don't seem to address the other forms of capital that I was describing before. So from the Regenerative Enterprise book, we look at 8 forms of capital, but there are other ways to understand value also. So we need to look at this not just in the approach of living capital versus financial capital, but also what kind of values we're bringing. The last thing that I want to talk about in the course, or in this lecture here, is a system that is brought up by Uwe Bronfenbrenner. And basically this is called ecological systems theory. And this whole approach looks at development. But I also like to look at this, or to show people in an individual approach how this connects to other kind of systems at play. So just quickly, Uwe Bronfenbrenner came up with this ecological systems theory, saying that we don't kind of develop in isolation, but there's all these things within our environments that will actually help in our development and make us develop in certain ways. It's not just about our biology, it's actually about the social systems. So we can look at the microsystem, okay? So we can look at ourselves within, just our own environment and, cater to our immediate needs and the things that we're learning kind of on our own here. But then we could put this into another system, so the mesosystem. So we're actually looking at extended networks. We're looking at daycare centers and families and doctor's offices and other things like that. So these things influence individuals. And actually, I would also say individuals influence these things too. So you have, conversations with your family. You can introduce different ideas to them. They might believe you or not, but anyhow, so there's kind of, reciprocal influence on these different systems. You could also look at the exosystem, so kind of more broad things, looking at neighbors, extended families, legal services, school boards, other things like that. So this is a little bit extended outside the mesosystem, but also have degrees of influence on the individual also, because they influence things within the mesosystem and vice versa. Now, one of the more important things to understand is that there's a macro system. So there's kind of broad ideologies, laws, customs, and there's kind of a mode of thinking that's already been imposed before we come into the world. So basically, there are things that exist before us, and there are kind of parameters on what's acceptable behavior or not, depending on what these conditions are. So especially, this is a good example, but if something's illegal, then definitely we're not supposed to partake in it, or it would be considered criminal activity, or finable activity, or basically a violation of the laws. So we have these parameters that bound the way that we understand things, basically bound our ideology, but also bound our own behavior within it. And right now, within these kind of laws and customs, one of the prevailing things within it is that we are part of a capitalist system. One way that, or the dominant way that we should have our economy, is actually by exchanging things with each other and trying to profit off of this. And by being profitable, we fit into this kind of ideology of, everybody should be doing this. And in order for us to kind of, have good livelihoods, and in order for work to function and all of these things, we need to buy into that kind of a culture. We need to work for people or become capitalists ourselves. And the whole extent is, we could start from the bottom and work our ways up to the top and obtain whatever they call the American dream. And this is part of the workings of our economy and our political system. Now, to change that is very difficult when we're looking at individuals. So the individual within that, unless they have a lot of power and influence, rarely could change these kind of higher macro systems. But what we need is a lot of people to then influence their mesosystem and the exosystems, and then hopefully have different understandings about the laws, ideologies, and parameters. And hopefully this goes in a way that's actually helpful for us and the planet, and not ways that are destructive, because this could go, into different ways. Sometimes the ideologies that come out are actually more harmful than the ones that existed. But anyhow, so our own individual behavior does not always change the larger structures. This is why I'm showing you this, okay? So just because you're making certain food choices doesn't mean that actually we're going to save the way or change the way that these companies function. And there could be an argument that, yes, if you hit their bottom line, they're going to adapt because they want to be profitable. But adaptation doesn't mean that they're going to change the way you want. They might just go find another market and, leave you behind. The other part of the system is that there's a chrono system, so all of these things change over time. So we could influence the larger systems, and we could influence the smaller systems, and they also influence us.